All right, let's talk about surveys. I'm going to pause here if you want to use this outline for your notes. So surveys are a type of research method that provides a quantitative, which means numeric as you know, description of trends, behaviors, attitudes, or opinions of a population by studying a sample of that population. We, in a survey, ask people about their attitudes, values, beliefs, behaviors, knowledge, and perceptions. A series of questions is asked, responses are collected, and conclusions are drawn. You probably are familiar with surveys because you've done course evaluations, you've probably taken surveys in your life, they're very common. And that is a good thing about surveys because generally people are pretty familiar with them if you're going to conduct one. So when should you do a survey? Well, first, you need to know something about the topic before you just start creating survey questions. So you have to understand enough about the topic to know what kind of questions to ask. And this is especially true if this is an emergent or new phenomenon. You really need to understand it to know what to ask so that people can answer appropriately. Also, you have to ask yourself, does the information already exist somewhere else? So the information that you want in your survey might already be available in another source. So for example, if you're interested in the crime rate in Seattle and you want to send a survey to the police chiefs, well, you don't need to do that because you can go to seattle.gov and download all the crime statistics. Also, can people actually tell you what you want to know? So some information that you want might not actually be well known or understood by people. So for example, if you say, how many grams of trans fat do you eat in a typical day? Nobody can answer that. So you need to have questions that people can actually answer. And then also, can people provide truthful answers? So people or organizations might not be willing to provide information even if they know it. So for example, will respondents answer honestly about illegal drug use? Probably not. So, although I'll say there are national teen drug surveys and stuff, but those people take very good care at figuring out how to ask people these kind of questions. So what are some advantages of doing a survey? By using self-report, you're kind of giving a voice to the participants, not as much as in qualitative research, but they are answering themselves. And self-report might be the only viable measure of some things, like attitudes especially. Surveys are fairly easy and pretty cheap to administer. You can collect a lot of data in a short time period. You can administer it in a lot of different ways, through the mail, on the phone, online, face-to-face. And surveys are going to be the method of choice if a research project really just wants to get a picture of a range of characteristics of a population. Like if you're we want to know college students' attitudes towards climate change. Well, a survey is going to be your easiest way to get it. In general, surveys have high external validity and high generalizability as long as you did a good job sampling. The representativeness and the size of the sample is really our number one thing that we'd look at in determining the credibility of a survey. Also, as I mentioned, people are generally pretty familiar with surveys, so they'll feel comfortable taking them. And once you have your survey data results, you can use them to establish correlations, which are measures of relationships between two or more variables, and how they're interconnected and related. So some disadvantages of surveys: even though we can use correlation on surveys, we can't establish causation. With causation, you may recall we talked about this when we talked about independent and dependent variables. You have to have the independent variable come before the dependent variable. In a survey, it's very hard to be able to do that. You could ask, when you were a kid, did you eat a lot of yogurt? And then you can say, how much TV do you watch today? But when you're asking people to recollect the past, it's not very accurate. In-person, face-to-face, and phone surveys can take a lot of time, and they can cost a lot of money and be a lot of effort, especially when interviewers have to make several follow-ups to reach the respondents. You also are measuring what people say that they do or think or feel, but not what they actually do. And this is really important when we talk about political campaign polling. People might say that they're going to vote for someone, but you don't actually know if they will. You also don't have any context for their answers because they're just filling out a number. Also, it can be difficult to get people to respond to surveys, especially if they're long. People do not answer unknown calls anymore, and very few people have house phones. So this is a big problem within the field of phone surveys. Also, surveys that are online miss out on people who don't use the internet, don't have good access to the internet, are worried about like paying for the internet per minute. So they're not going to take those surveys, so the representativeness isn't great. Also, on surveys, you have to worry about social desirability bias. So especially if there is someone physically asking them a question, people tend to provide more socially acceptable answers. And in the 2016 election, this became a big issue because people would leave the voting place, and a researcher or someone from a survey firm would say, "Can I ask you who you voted for?" And they might be embarrassed to admit who they voted for, so they will say the socially acceptable answer. Similarly, if you ask someone a question like, how racist are you on a scale of 1 to 5? Standing there in front of that person, they're going to say they're not racist, even if that isn't true. So social desirability bias is a big disadvantage of surveys. Also, interviewer effects. The person that is actually conducting the survey, if it's a physical person, or even over the phone, can influence the way that people answer. So for example, if it is a woman who is asking the survey questions and asks something about like a man's sexual activity, maybe he'd be embarrassed to talk about that in front of this strange woman. So it's difficult because who you have interviewed does matter. Some issues that we see with surveys methodologically is tied often to reliability, which you've already learned about. But within surveys, we're really concerned about reliability in terms of survey items being consistent. So some errors that we see a lot: first, measurement error, which are problems in the quality of surveys that when items are not organized in a really clear and unbiased fashion. So for example, if you ask someone something that really gets them politically charged, like you ask about a controversial political topic, if they get really emotional about answering that question, it's going to impact all the rest of the questions that they answer, that they're still kind of worked up or they're angry that they were asked a question. Also, non-response is a big issue, that when people decline to participate in the survey or they skip large portions of it. This happens all the time, and sometimes you just have to throw those out. And then also the quality of the sampling, since size and representativeness of the sample really matters, as well as if they had a good sampling frame to begin with. That has a huge impact on the quality of the survey. And we see this a lot with political polling, that if the sample wasn't good, the answers aren't going to be good. Improving question quality is the cheapest and most efficient way to improve the quality of surveys. That is for sure. So we will talk a lot about question wording today. So how do you actually do a survey? Well, first you need to identify the population that you're interested in. Who are you trying to get at? All Canadian adults, all Mexican teenagers, people with a college degree? What is it that you're really trying to make an argument about? And then determining your sampling strategy is key. After you've figured out your sampling strategy, you have to start developing the questionnaire. In general, we're not just inventing questions. We're usually using existing operationalizations. Then it's really important to pilot or pre-test, you can use either word, the questionnaire and the survey procedures. That you could, have your friends or family members take it, they can say like, this wording doesn't really make sense, or these questions are too long, or there was a typo here. You got to do it. Also, more formally, there's cognitive testing, where someone takes a survey and then afterwards you really go through with them to ask them if they understood the questions. I used to work doing survey research in places where there were significant parts of the population that couldn't read or write or do basic math. And so it was really important that we did cognitive testing to make sure that people that we wanted to know how they felt about things, that they could understand the questions. Field testing is a practice run of the actual survey procedures. And it's really important just to know if something funny happens that you need to address. You also need to recruit and train interviewers. And again, interviewers here doesn't mean you're doing a qualitative interview, but they're the people that are physically taking the survey, whether it's over the phone or in person. And it's very important that the interviewers seem friendly and trustworthy. And then you actually start collecting data that is going to visit households, making those telephone calls, whatever it is. And after you're collecting the data, you are entering and preparing the data for analysis. Nowadays, thankfully, a lot of surveys are done on iPads or other tablet devices that makes it so that the data is already digitized. But if you come to my campus office, you'll see I have file cabinets full of paper surveys. And so you'd have them fill it out with pen and paper, and then you'd have to sit there and you'd enter it in. And of course, there's going to be errors because you get tired of typing numbers all the time. And we'll talk about this more in a future module. You have to clean the data and see if there's anything wrong with it. And then you actually do your data analysis and present your findings. So you do the statistical analyses of the survey data, which would include descriptive statistics like the mean, median, mode, standard deviation of all the variables. You answer your hypotheses, and then you prepare a report of your findings. So some general tips on question wording. Questions should collect either directly or indirectly the respondent's reasons for having a specific behavior or attitude. Questions should be clear. They should not suggest a particular answer. They shouldn't embarrass someone, and they shouldn't be double-barreled. I'll look at an example. And again, we usually get question wording from past research. So one problem with question wording is double-barreled items. So here's an example. Please indicate how much you agree or disagree with each of the following statements about the child care program. I feel welcomed by staff and other youth at the center. So the problem with this question is that maybe you feel welcomed by the other youth, but you don't feel welcomed by the staff. So how do you answer this question? You need to separate out these questions to be two different questions, and that problem is called being double-barreled. Another problem is bias. So here is an example. Community organizing is hard. Do leadership trainings help you feel prepared for community organizing? By opening that question with saying community organizing is hard, you're already biasing them to thinking the community organizing is hard. You don't know, maybe they don't feel that way. So you need to have a straightforward question. The leadership trainings prepare me for community organizing. Done. Another problem is double negatives. That basically this just makes it really confusing. So here's, does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? With all those negative words in there, you have no idea what they're actually asking. So you have to be as straightforward as possible. Now, what about the choices they have for answering these questions? You have to make sure the response options are appropriate. So, are they exhaustive? The full range of answer options are in there. That also you have a balanced number of negative and positive answers, so it needs to be either 2 and 2, or 2 and 2 and 1 in the middle, or 3 and 3 and 1 in the middle, or 3 and 3. They need to be mutually exclusive. There needs to be one and only one possible answer for any response. And do you label them or unlabeled? You've probably seen this in surveys you've filled out. Some of them will say like 1, totally dissatisfied, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with no labels, and then 7, totally satisfied. And then you have to figure out what the in-between means. If you can, it is better to add labels to every choice. Rating questions are response categories in a rank order between two extreme positions. Very important, not at all important. These are pretty common. Also, semantic differential scales assess responses to statements and measure a concept, like bad to good, dull to fun, warm to cold. Likert scales are very common, that are disagree to agree with a statement. They are usually either 5 items or 7, so you have a neutral point in the middle. Although we do sometimes have wording that are called forced choice options, where we only have even numbers. So it would be like disagree, somewhat disagree, somewhat agree, agree, so that they can't answer that middle. Types of survey design. Cross-sectional designs mean that questions were just asked one period in time. You ask people once, that's it. Longitudinal designs, there's a couple different types, but these involve questions being asked at multiple points in time. Either individuals or people of a certain demographic profile are asked their opinion or something over time. These are super useful because you can sometimes make causal arguments because you have different time points. Remember that for an independent variable to be established, it needs to have happened before the dependent variable. And so you can do that if you have longitudinal surveys. But it is hard, it is expensive, and you lose people or households from the study all the time, and that's called attrition. But we do really like them. So 2 types of longitudinal surveys. One is called a trend study, and this is just seeing how trends change over time on a particular topic. Different groups of people are included as respondents, but it's the topics change. So it's different people, same topic. So for example, asking people how they feel about same-sex marriage. We have trends that show us from the 1950s to now how Americans feel about this. It's not the same people being asked, but because the sampling is generally the same, we can argue that it's over time. Panel studies, on the other hand, are asking the exact same person over time. These are very expensive, but they're super useful. And they're used sometimes in audience research, medical research. One that I'm really familiar with is an education study that measures from pregnancy up until adulthood and asks questions about nutrition and schooling and tries to make arguments about particular things that happen in childhood and how that'll affect adult outcomes. There's also another one that I didn't put on this slide, but it's called a cohort study. It's like a panel study, but it's not asking the exact same person over time. Instead, it's on a type of person. So, for example, you could do a study where you're like, people who had their kindergarten interrupted by the pandemic and had to do remote learning in kindergarten. You could do a survey of kids like that when they're in kindergarten. 5 years later, you could do the same survey, not on the same kids necessarily, but on kids that experience their kindergarten year with remote learning. So that's called a cohort study. So there's a lot of different ways that we can run surveys. The traditional one is the face-to-face interview administrated survey. These are good because they have a really high response rate. That means that when people are approached at their home about doing these surveys, they're standing in front of the door, and so people do respond. But they're really expensive. You can have those interview effects that we talked earlier about, that like the gender or presentation of the interviewer matters. Also, you're sending people out into like homes and stuff, so there is a safety issue involved. More common are telephone interview surveys, and the CATI, the CATI, that's computer assisted telephone interview. It's a system where people are entering the answers. Like if they're like, scale of 1 to 5, how much do you like this? 5, they enter 5. It's really good for open-ended questions because you can ask and you can get clarification. You don't have to worry about sending people out into the world and making sure that they eat and that they're safe. But it only really works if a lot of people have phone access, and generally it's lower response rates because, again, people just don't answer their phone to unknown callers anymore, and people don't want to be on the phone for so long. Self-administered surveys through the mail are really good for sensitive items that you want people to be able to fill out in their own home without an interviewer seeing, so they have some privacy. They're also pretty cheap. They are time consuming though, because you have to mail them out, wait for people to mail them back in. Because it's not computerized, you have to physically enter the data into a computer. But they still do exist. And then online web-based surveys. This is obviously a huge growing area, and it's pretty cool because you could have like a video inside of it or something. And also the data is already going to be digital. However, it doesn't work very well if people don't have access to the internet, they don't have access to devices. Sometimes people fill out these surveys, they just like click 5 all the way down. So there's a lot of response biases and errors and sometimes missing data. Online web surveys definitely look better today than they did even 5 years ago, but they can be pretty tough. And as you know, I mean, even when you take a Canvas quiz versus a paper pencil quiz, there are differences that you feel. But certainly this is the future. And whether those online surveys are, something that just pops up in a window on your web browser or that you're being directed to go to them, they are the majority of what people are using nowadays. So in addition to collecting survey data firsthand, there are additional options. It is increasingly common, if people have the money, to hire a company like a research firm to collect the data that you want, so that you can hire these companies like Qualtrics, SurveyMonkey. You might have seen surveys with these before, that they do all the work for you, which is awesome. So that is great. Omnibus surveys are surveys where multiple researchers will come together and just ask a couple questions. Like they'll all agree, okay, we're going to ask the same questions about age, gender, educational attainment, etc. And then we're going to have these little mini, just 5 questions from my survey, 6 questions from yours, 8 questions from yours. Another thing that's really cool is publicly available data sets. There are tons of organizations around the world that conduct surveys on important social issues. So the American National Election Survey, Data.gov, the General Social Science Survey. There are barometers around the world, Asian Barometer, African Barometer, Eurobarometer. There are Pew Center for American Life has these, and it's data that's available, and sometimes they have online like web portals that you can just put in a couple things to know what people said, but also you can download their data and play around with it yourself. And this is an awesome option for students to be able to get practice on generating hypotheses. They're based in a literature review, and then running statistical analyses, but not having to do all this work and spend all this money on collecting data. So if surveys are something that you're interested in, there are many resources where you can download data and play around with it yourself. The University of Michigan has a survey data archive that has a ton of things on different topics. But any of these sites you can play around with and learn more about how surveys work and how you can do analyses with them.